Hi guys, today we're going to talk about um, organisms that have an alternation of generations for their life cycle. And this is a life cycle of sexually reproducing organisms, although there are other sexually reproducing organisms that use other types of life cycle strategies. Some of those life cycle strategies include the diploid dominant cycle, which is similar to humans and other animals, where the body of the organism is diploid, and the only haploid cells in their body are gametes, which means there's no separate multicellular generation known as a gametophyte. There's no haploid body. There's only a diploid body. And the cells that are created by meiosis then immediately fuse by fertilization or syngamy. Those cells don't grow into another body. Another strategy is the haploid dominant cycle, and that is employed by things like certain fungi and certain algae. The haploid dominant life cycle is the opposite of the diploid dominant cycle, where the body of the organism is haploid. And so when haploid sex cells or gametes come together by fertilization or by syngamy, they create a zygote. The zygote is a diploid, and that's the only diploid cell that is produced by these haploid dominant bodies. So the body is haploid, it's full of haploid cells. The only diploid cell is the zygote, and then that zygote, the zygote itself is going to divide by meiosis to produce new spores that will grow into new haploid bodies. But we're going to talk about species that undergo an alternation of generations. And those species, like plants and certain algae, have both haploid and diploid bodies. They have multicellular diploid bodies that are known as the sporophyte, and they have multicellular haploid bodies that are known as the gametophyte. So this would be a good time, if you're not very familiar with these terms, to maybe pause the recording and go back to a chapter in an intro biology textbook on meiosis. You should be familiar with the terms haploid. Haploid organisms have a single set of chromosomes. Diploid organisms have two sets of chromosomes. One of those sets came from their mother, and one of those sets came from the father. Now, in organisms that have an alternation of generation, there are two distinct multicellular bodies. There's the haploid body, which is called the gametophyte, and the cells in the haploid body or the gametophyte body all have a single set of chromosomes. And there's the sporophyte body, and the cells in the sporophyte body all produce 2N or diploid cells, and they all have two sets of chromosomes. So in the diploid body, in certain structures known as sporangia, spores are produced by meiosis. Meiosis is the process where 2N or diploid cells divide and reduce their genetic material by half in order to become haploid cells. So in the sporophyte body, there are sporangia, and in the sporangia, meiosis occurs, producing spores, and those spores are now haploid. So now we've gone from the sporophyte or diploid generation to the haploid generation. Those spores are going to divide by mitosis. They're going to create more copies of themselves, more haploid cells, which are going to grow up into the gametophyte body, a multicellular gametophyte body. The gametophyte body is then going to produce the sexual reproductive cells, the gametes, the egg or the sperm. Gametes in a gametophyte body are produced by mitosis because the cells in the gametophyte body are haploid, the gametes are haploid, and so the process that produces gametes from a gametophyte body is mitosis. The different gametes, the egg and the sperm, are going to combine by fertilization or by syngamy. They're going to fuse, and that's going to result in the zygote, which is a diploid cell. The zygote is going to divide by mitosis to produce a new sporophyte body. And that's the entire cycle of the alternation of generations. Now, there's different ways that different organisms go about these alternation of generations. There's plants that produce only a single type of sporangium, which results in only a single type of spore. So, examples of these are going to be things like ferns and bryophytes, or mosses and liverworts. The sporophyte body produces sporangia, and those sporangia produce spores. Those spores grow into a gametophyte, and the gametophyte produces both egg and sperm. There's only a single type of gametophyte that produces both egg and sperm. In other types of plants, like gymnosperms and angiosperms, you have what's known as heterospory. In heterosporous plants, there are two types of sporangia. There's megasporangia that produce megaspores, and there are microsporangia that produce microspores. The megasporangia produce megaspores, which result in a female gametophyte. Okay, the female gametophyte is responsible for producing eggs. The microsporangia make microspores, and microspores are going to germinate and become the male gametophyte. And the male gametophyte only produces the sperm. Okay, so instead of having a single type of spore that results in a single gametophyte that produces both egg and sperm, heterosporous species make two different types of spores. Those spores are different morphologically. Megaspores are much larger than microspores, and they also result in the production of different types of reproductive cells. Megaspores produce female gametophytes that make eggs, and microspores produce male gametophytes that make sperm. So here's an example of the of the homosporous fern. And so you can see this is the sporophyte, this is the plant, the sporophyte plant body, and each of these little brown dots on the underside of the leaflets is a sporangium. And those sporangia are making lots of little spores. Those spores are going to fall down to the moist soil, and they're going to produce this heart-shaped gametophyte. Now, each of these spores is similar to the others. They produce a single type of gametophyte. And on this single gametophyte, you're making both archegonia, which are structures that make eggs, and you're also making antheridia, which are the structures that are producing the sperm. So from a single type of spore, you get a single type of gametophyte, which makes both eggs and sperm. This is different from things like flowering plants, which are heterosporous. In a heterosporous organism like this flower, this lily flower, you have microsporangia that are located in these anthers. This is the inside of the sporangium. And you can see all these little microspores being produced. Those microspores are also called pollen. And inside those pollen are the sperm. And in a very separate part of the plant, down here in the ovary, you have ovules. And those are going to produce the megasporangia. The megasporangia will result in the production of the female gametophytes. And the female gametophytes are going to have the egg. So here's your egg down here. So these are two separate gametophytes, the pollen and the ovules, and they're going to make egg and sperm in different bodies. You have different spores resulting in different gametophytes that make egg in one type and sperm in the other type. All right, so excuse me. Let's look at the angiosperm life cycle specifically. Now, excuse me, in many organisms that undergo an alternation of generation, it's very distinct whether you have the sporophyte body or whether you're looking at the gametophyte body. But when you get to angiosperms, the gametophyte body has become very, very reduced in size, and it's very hard to see without a microscope. In fact, the male gametophyte of the angiosperm can be only 2 or 3 cells large. The pollen grain is the male gametophyte, and it consists of the generative cell and 2 sperm cells, or it may only consist of the vegetative cell and the generative cell, which will then split later. So that multicellular gametophyte body has been highly reduced. It's completely dependent on the sporophyte body for both protection and for the nourishment for its development. So here you can see the sporangium, the microsporangium, the male sporangium, and they're producing microspores, which then produce the male gametophyte. Here's a pollen grain. You can see the large vegetative cell, and inside this you have a smaller generative cell. This generative cell will then split into 2 sperm. This is the male gametophyte. At this point, it is only 2 cells large. On the other hand, you have the female gametophyte. The female gametophyte is located within the mature ovule, which is located inside the ovary. So at this point in development of the ovary, you have immature ovules, which are producing microsporangia, which will produce microspores, and those microspores will then grow into the mature female gametophyte. The mature female gametophyte of most angiosperms consists of 7 cells. Consists of 7 cells and 8 nuclei. So again, you can see that it is highly reduced, and it's located deeply nestled within the tissues of the sporophyte body. The gametophyte bodies, especially the female gametophyte body, is inseparable from the sporophyte body. All right, so let's take a moment and think about this question. Angiosperms are heterosporous because they make both egg and sperm. Is that true or false? So I want you to answer that on your own, and we'll come back to it in a couple weeks when I'm back in class. But I want you to write it out on a piece of paper, your answer. Oh, never mind. So that sentence is false. How could you make that sentence true? Okay, that's what I want you to write out on your piece of paper. How will you have to modify that sentence so that it's a true statement? All right. So here we're looking at the life cycle of an angiosperm. And when you study this, I want you to consider this in terms of the generic alternation of generation life cycle. And remember, if an organism exhibits alternation of generation, what characteristic does it have to exhibit? It has to have both a multicellular sporophyte body, and it also has to have a multicellular gametophyte body. So what is our sporophyte body here? It's the plant, right? It's the green leafy plant. And that plant produces flowers. And within those flowers, you have the gametophyte bodies. Okay, deep within the flower. The entire flower itself is not a gametophyte. Most of the flower is part of the sporophyte body. But within the ovule, you have the female gametophyte, and the pollen is the male gametophyte. So a plant, an angiosperm plant, grows from its seed, and that's the sporophyte body that you see. At some point in its development, depending on the plant, it's going to make flowers. And when those flowers are mature, they'll have mature male gametophytes in their pollen. Those male gametophytes began in the sporangia. The sporangia are part of the sporophyte body, and within that sporangia, meiosis occurs. Meiosis is the process where the diploid cells divide to become 4 haploid cells. So meiosis is the process that brings the diploid body into the haploid generation. So meiosis results in spores. And in this case, inside the anthers, you have the sporangia, and those are going to make microspores. The microspores are going to divide by mitosis, that's germination, and they're going to produce the pollen. And the pollen is the male gametophyte. In the ovary, you have the female or the megasporangia. Remember, the sporangia are still part of the diploid body. They're still part of the sporophyte body. And it's that sporangia where meiosis occurs. So within the sporangia, meiosis occurs, and that's going to bring the sporophyte generation to the gametophyte generation. That's where you go from having diploid cells to having haploid cells. And that's going to occur in the ovule. So you get meiosis occurring in the ovule, which results in a megaspore. The megaspore is going to divide by mitosis to produce the female gametophyte. And within that female gametophyte, you have an egg. That's your gamete. Within the pollen, you have sperm. That's your male gamete. Pollination is going to occur. When pollination occurs, the pollen grains are deposited on the stigma. A pollen tube grows through the style and the ovary wall and eventually makes it to the ovule. In angiosperms, you have a phenomenon called double fertilization. There's 2 sperm cells in each pollen grain. One of them is going to fertilize the egg, and when the egg and one sperm fuse, that produces the diploid zygote, which is going to become the next sporophyte generation. But you have a second fertilization event where one sperm fertilizes 2 polar nuclei that are located in the central cell of the female gametophyte. And that's going to produce a triploid or 3N nutritive tissue. We'll talk more about endosperm when we talk about embryology. All right, so double fertilization after the seed has a chance to develop produces a mature seed, and that seed is then going to grow into the mature sporophyte body, and the cycle continues. So you start out with your sporophyte, which is diploid. Meiosis occurs in the sporangia. The sporangia are located in the anthers, for the microsporangia and in the ovules for the megasporangia, that's going to result in the production of the male and female gametophyte bodies. The male and female gametophytes produce the sperm and the egg. Those are going to fuse in angiosperms by double fertilization after pollination, and that's going to result in the production of a new seed. Here you can see pollination and double fertilization a little bit better. The pollen lands on the stigma, and a pollen tube grows through the style and down the ovary wall. Eventually, the sperm are released into the female gametophyte. One sperm fuses with the egg here. That becomes the zygote, which becomes the embryo. The second sperm fuses with these polar nuclei, and that's going to result in the triploid endosperm. Right after this female gametophyte is fertilized, it will develop into a seed. Okay, here's just another picture of the same thing. The pollen tube enters the female gametophyte. The sperm are released. Where's my mouse? Here's the sperm. One of them will fuse with the egg. Here. One of them will fuse with the polar nuclei. This becomes triploid tissue, the endosperm, and this becomes the zygote, which develops into the embryo. And this becomes your seed. Okay. All right, so we already did the plant body last week, so that I didn't have to do that on the recording. So this is all the material that you have for this week. You have an assignment 1, which is located on the lecture tab of the website, and that should cover both the angiosperm body, which we did last week, and the alternation of generations. So make sure you have that done by the time I get back, so the first week of December. All right, you guys have a good week, and I'll see you.